Today, a pod in 2 acts. Act 1, you've heard plenty about Mar-a-Lago, the FBI searches, and the unspooling drama about security issues and nuclear secrets. But friend of the pod, Bob Garfield, says there's more to the story. Then, as a growing chorus of voices says that social media is addictive to teens, California was poised to write some groundbreaking legislation. Now it's dead. So what happened? And finally, Snapchat puts in place some parental controls that actually seem promising. I'm Steven Rosenbaum, and this is Future Forward. Let's launch. You know, quiet week, end of the summer, not much going on. I'm just wondering, though, just off the record between you and I, if I had some nuclear secrets to sell, would you be a buyer?
Would I be a buyer for nuclear secrets? That depends. Would it come with like baked goods? Because that's what I crave. I have no strict use for nuclear secrets, but if you would sweeten the deal somehow, and I'm speaking literally, then we could talk. But we'd have to do it quietly because it turns out, and this kind of blew me away, it turns out it's illegal.
So this show has 2 chapters in it. We're going to talk about the whole Trump Mar-a-Lago meltdown and more importantly, reasonable media people's willingness to kind of wade into the nonsense, in part because I think they have nothing better to do than make shit up on Twitter. But then we also will talk about what's happening in California with protecting, theoretically protecting internet children's rights. And then I think Snap's interesting product release will be kind of that'll be the good news story at the end of the half hour. But let's just start with this Trump thing. So, it's easy to say on a slow news week, boy, he really kind of took it on the chin. But, he seems, he fundraises on drama, right? So, by that measure, he's had a good week.
Sure. As he famously said 7 or 8 years ago, I could mishandle nuclear secrets in the middle of Fifth Avenue and my base would still support me. And, if it weren't eminently clear before, there is literally nothing that this guy can do or can be revealed as having done that is going to change the idée fixe of the MAGA base. And it will all be interpreted, whatever it is, will be interpreted as part of the hitch hunt, part of the persecution, part of the deep state, part of the corrupt, pedophile, democratic and media cabal to damage this visionary. It simply doesn't matter. And so there's 2 things. How he is going to squeeze this for more support from his base, who could theoretically get him a nomination in 24, and how much money he can squeeze from him, because there has never been a separation between his political ambitions and his ability to raise money nominally for campaigns and defense funds, but which actually essentially go into the pocket of him and his cronies. So it was a good news for Trump Inc. week and bad news for Trump personally, because this is going to have legal consequences probably well before his other vulnerabilities have actual consequences for him. So he's in for a rough slog with the civil and criminal courts for the next several years.
From your lips to God's ears, but I want to get to the number of people that have very quickly amplified any number of bizarre statements, but I want to start with something fabulously boring, which is this. You may know this guy. I did not. This is Mark Hartling, and he posted what I thought was like a very delightfully boring Twitter thread in which he said, everyone's talking about classification, so let me go through. And he did a 21 tweet stream of This is what classified means. This is what secret means. This is what top secret means. This is how the government handles all these things. This is what requires a skip. It was fabulously detailed, and I found myself reading it going, thank you, Twitter. This is a really good civic thing to do, to publish this information in this way. That being said, that was the only rational thing that I heard on Twitter. And then on the other side of the universe, this Jason Kint handed off this question about Breitbart and why Breitbart was the receiver of the what do you call it?
The search warrant.
The search warrant.
Yeah.
And the fact that Breitbart specifically did not hide the names of the agents. And then this, I don't know how much of this you caught, but then it kind of went down this super creepy rabbit hole with the phrase helicopter passengers.
Yeah. So what happened there is that the right-wing activists, as they often do, will dox anyone on the left they deem worthy of having their harassment or destruction, right? And this goes from librarians who have an LGBTQ themed book on their shelves to FBI agents who sign search warrants, to the judges who authorized the search warrants. Never mind that it's due process and fully transparent, but obviously they're the enemy, and they shall be destroyed. And the means of destruction are by saying who they are, so other right-wing ghouls can identify where they live, where their kids are, what their kids' names are, and just terrorize the shit out of them. This is an alt-right technique that is well honed over the last 15 years. So that's why the assumption that Breitbart got it for the purposes of issuing the unredacted search warrant, exposing the FBI agents to harassment. Now, the helicopter thing is a slightly different thing. The presumption was that the remark about helicopters was, sort of not quite code, in reference to dropping these people out of helicopters into the oceans, the way Augusto Pinochet did in Chile with his enemies, and the way also the Argentine government did during the military dictatorship there. It's a way of disappearing people, let's just say extrajudicially, and if not extrajudiciously. And so that was the assumption, but then as you know, because you called my attention to it, it went down one rung or 12 rungs farther in the rabbit hole by someone digging up the helicopter crash of Trump executives, his casino executives, back in the late 80s when he was under investigation for money laundering through his casinos.
But that was back before we thought of him as murderous. So it seemed like a terrible tragedy. Now, in hindsight, you're like, boy, that seems a little bit suspicious that all of those people that could have testified against him all died collectively in a helicopter crash. But to your point, and this is, I guess, maybe where we're going with the pod today, is, the speed at which it went from news reporting about an FBI search down this rabbit hole, whatever it is, and how many kind of, some that you expect and others that were kind of shocking, Republicans kind of just climbed in. And so, like, this is a Huffington Post piece, but it lays out all of the different people and how they were, So basically, I'll just read it to you. It said, Republicans went hard after the FBI soon after the news broke. Representative Paul Gosar said, we must destroy the FBI. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said, defund the FBI. Steve Scalise, the House second-ranking Republican, further stoked the fires in the FBI by suggesting, without evidence, that some FBI agents, quote, went rogue. that was so far beyond the pale that Steve Ducey on Fox News essentially said back to Scalise, Steve, who went rogue? They were following a search warrant. And I'm like, it must take a particular level of outrage to get Steve Ducey, who's, by the way, name is Ducey, so kind of looks like a cartoon character.
Yeah.
And then
That's
it goes
the most
further.
rational thing he has said in 15 years. But anyway.
Yeah. And the question is there like a Post-it note on the staff refrigerator saying, it's okay to move slightly off the hard left pro-Trump center? But then, it goes on. So like Newt Gingrich, Alex Jones, Charles Kirk, Steve Bannon, all aired conspiracy theories, which, some of those you expect. Rand Paul was in there. I mean,
yeah, he was a U.S. senator who said that the FBI planted the incriminating documents, only to discover that 24 hours later, Trump was saying, "Oh no, I had them because they were declassified." So there's no evidence of the planting of anything. On the contrary, the target of the search warrant has conceded, I would say, confessed to being in full possession of them. He claims legally, almost certainly not, but we shall see. But
here's what's scary about where we've ended up, and why I think the Democrats, and I use that, understanding. I mean, the Republicans tend to actually each get talking points. There's like a machine that says, here are the talk. Well, I guess maybe they watch Fox News. I don't believe the Democrats are quite as mechanical in their positioning. But what's scary to me is, it went from a news story to a bunch of just not even remotely credible made up garbage in like 48 hours. And I'm frightened to admit this, and you can be less of a friend of mine when I say this out loud, but it's like, there was a moment when Trump said, well, I'm the president, I can declassify anything. And so I declassified all the shit I took home. I was like, okay, I kind of get that. And then I was like, what? I mean,
yeah. So just a fine point there. It's unclear whether the president can just, as someone said, telepathically declassify information. He has broad, almost absolute authority to declassify anything, but there is a process that even the president has to follow, an administrative process for declassification, which clearly he did not do. But there is some, there's some belief by scholars in the area of classification that he can essentially just will something declassified. However, even if that's true, even if you look at the most favorable for Trump interpretation of the declassification process, which is pretty Byzantine, you're still not allowed to possess these documents. Classified, declassified, or not, they don't belong to him. And the evidence shows that first he took them with him. Secondly, that there were 15 crates of stuff that they had to send back to the National Archives when the archives realized that they had never been turned over. Thirdly, that the government had been trying to get the rest back and had subpoenaed him for the rest of the documents. Fourthly, that his lawyers had assured the government that everything had been returned. Then finally, the search warrant, and these highly classified material, including stuff that presumably involves some part of the nuclear arsenal. So even if he can legally, telepathically declassify, he's still in a shit ton of trouble. But can I respond to what you were getting towards about we all know that the right acts mechanically, reflexively to say the worst possible interpretation of events planted. Trump said it was planted, then Rand Paul said it was planted. Just absolutely insane. But to me, the most horrifying aspect of this whole thing is what I have read, mostly in social media on the left. Now, so-called mainstream media has done a very, very good job of parsing the law and trying to explain the Byzantine classification and declassification process to try to understand what potential consequences could be for Trump, including fucking jail, right? But on Twitter, I have been seeing these with threads stated by people who should know better with absolute certainty why it's obvious that Trump was selling nuclear secrets to the Saudis, and they invoke, the Crown Prince, they invoke Jared, they talk about the bribe of the state investment in a fund that he was starting. All of these really sketchy sounding things threaded together Glenn Beck style to paint a picture of a long-standing conspiracy for Trump to profit by selling secrets to the Saudis. Like, what? Oh, it's plausible. We know this guy's a career criminal and fraud and narcissist and monster. We know that. I wouldn't be surprised for an instant if any of it were true, but there's no evidence that any of it's true. The only thing that we know to be true is that people will fill in the gaps of evidence with what they think feels right to them. And feeling is not knowing. And Twitter doesn't understand that.
And but I think we could go back to, the early days of CNN, when, part of what made the news business work when it was a print business was that every page cost money to print. And so, the new, what people call it in the news business, I'm not sure that all of our listeners know this phrase, and it's a little bit antiquated now, but what they used to do was fill the news hole. And the news hole was designed after you sold the advertising.
Yeah, so the news hole was about 60% of the pages of the paper. If you went over 40% for advertising, then it was deemed an advertising circular, and you couldn't get the cheap delivery rates from the Postal Service. So that's why the news hole is the news hole. It's about 60% of your newspaper.
So along comes CNN, and the whole concept of any bracket around the size of the news hole goes away, because you got this 24-hour thing you have to fill, or in the case of the internet, an endless number of pages. And all of a sudden, what the Democrats find themselves in is you have two choices now. One is you can say outrageous shit and be in the conversation, or you can say, as I said before the pod started, I was like, we could start by talking about what Nancy Pelosi said about Mar-a-Lago, which is nothing, because that's appropriate, or what Joe Biden said about Mar-a-Lago, which is essentially nothing. And, but the danger of saying nothing is that you hand over the keys to the other guys who fill the endless news hole with garbage. And I'm deeply troubled by the choice between, being equally outrageous to get in the game, or being silent and being therefore not in the game. I think.
Okay, don't be troubled, Steve.
Yeah.
There's three reasons why. And I will give you the usual caveat. I'm not a Democrat. I haven't been a Democrat for more than 40 years. The reason I exist is to hate the Republican Party. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not a loyal Democrat or any kind of Democrat at all. But over the last years, that's definitely my side, because they're not Republicans, right? Now, there's three reasons why what they're doing is exactly right. Number one, you're never going to win the battle of rhetoric against the Republicans anyway. So just let them blow hot air, and you can bask in it. That's one thing. Number two, if you say nothing that you've said can come back to haunt you, right? Now, these Republicans who say, like Rand Paul, who are talking about planted evidence, and others talking about the politicization of the Justice Department, it will all be clear that eventually that's bullshit. So they're going to have to deal with the blowback for things that they do say. Thirdly, not only do the Democrats can take a posture of some sort of moral authority by not gloating about what's happening now and just sitting there and letting the process of justice take its course, They also don't want to step on the incredible political news and policy news that they've had. The less they say, the less the Trump outrages will overshadow this the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which is a triumph in the fight against climate change and the ability for Medicare to negotiate with pharma. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that's very, very, very important. And it's actually historic, and they don't want it to be completely usurped by Mar-a-Lago. And not to mention, the killing of the head of Al Qaeda, which is, all but disappeared under the January 6th investigation. So, the less they say about this, the more their change in political fortunes will become apparent as we head into a midterm. So, strategically, I think they've made the right decision.
I mean, I think my fear, you've calmed me slightly, but I think my fear is I spent a lot of time describing the Trump base as this over amplified but relatively small, and then as I became less sanguine about it, I was like, all right, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 30, but I think a lot about two things. One, if all you do is watch Fox News and read Breitbart all day, how could you think anything but what they're telling you? And secondly, am I not to some extent guilty of that by, I don't watch MSNBC religiously, and I think I have a reasonably balanced news diet, but when I try and absorb hard right radical content to be balanced, it's very hard to do for me. I mean, it takes real effort.
It's 72 or 73 million adults, right? So it's about a third of the electorate is MAGA, and they're not going anywhere. They're not going to be influenced by the news except to have their worldviews hardened. That's what Fox and Breitbart do. Fox has made endless billions of dollars making people feel good by making them angry about the things that they wish to be angry about. They are. I know that there has been a lot of walking back from the deplorables characterization. I'm not walking back. I'm charging right in. It is a deplorable mentality that feeds on this stuff, and they are not created by Fox. They are energized and empowered by Fox, and there is nothing that the Democrats or the left-wing media or the left-wing media, the explicitly left-wing media or the
mainstream,
mainly moderate mainstream media have to say. It's irrelevant to their view of reality. I'm not giving them a free pass as victims of propaganda. I know we've had this conversation before, probably on this podcast. Cops who investigate con men, grifters, bunco, fraud, they tend to have very little sympathy for the victims because the victims themselves are predisposed to try to get something for nothing. And they are not innocent parties in their own victimization. And so, I know it's unpopular and elitist, but I don't give a shit what they think. and I don't worry about, whether they feel justified or validated or vindicated, because they're not living in reality, and I'm not going to be bothered by it.
Which brings us almost perfectly to the doorstep of this thing called the internet. So our second chapter is to talk about a bill that was kind of making its way through the California legislature that I thought actually, was pretty right-headed. And, if you think about what GDPR has done in the US, the thing about the way the internet is built is that if one state makes a law, that there isn't really an easy way for the platforms to say, oh, we need to behave this way in California and then this way in New York. And so a California law had it gone through, could have had immediate national consequences.
Just as it did, for example, 25 and 30 years ago for air pollution standards, right? They don't make separate cars for California, so the California's regulations were de facto national regulations. And so, this it was a modern example of that phenomenon.
Yeah. So the Wall Street Journal piece, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's accidental that they use the word killed in the headline, and then they use the word, no, I'm sorry. They used the word killed in the first graph. California lawmakers killed a bill Thursday that would have allowed government lawyers to sue social media companies for features that allegedly harmed children by causing them to become addicted. Well, what excited, the reason why I think that got very little play was in the hopes that the individual platforms, while it has potentially earth-shattering consequences for their businesses, if the law was put into place across the board, then the bigger players would have more resources to manage it. So, for example, Facebook might be the target of some of those actions, but would also, have more dollars to play with than, for example, Twitter does. That being said, it was sad to me that it was killed, and I'm not surprised given that it's California, which means it's San Francisco, which means it's essentially the white hot center of all of the power and money that has built the internet and is now also amplifying and transmitting hate speech and misinformation, essentially with no real measurable ability to kind of manage it on their own.
Right. But to be clear, what this legislation would have provided, it's not to censor misinformation or disinformation. It would give people the right to sue the platforms for addicting their children with malice aforethought.
Yeah.
It's a public health, it's the opportunity to bring private litigation on a public health matter, parallel to, for example, tobacco law, and how the lawsuits against the tobacco companies changed the face of the industry worldwide. Not enough; they're still killing literally 8 million people a year, but it's better than 50 million, which is what it was 20 years ago. So, it was very important potential legislation that would have had a national impact. And, I'm sad to see it go. But you alluded to something else, which is just the threat of this kind of legislation does bring the platforms to the table. It will force them, Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, to sue for peace by doing internally some of the things that they would have had to do had the legislation gone forward. And Facebook is not a great example because they've talked a lot about culpability and responsibility, and they've apologized a lot, but they've done nothing to their algorithm, which is the core of their content delivery and their advertising business, to undo any of the harms they have caused. So there's not a great amount of evidence that the platforms will make important changes in order to avoid regulation, legislation, and litigation. But we can always hope.
Well, and that's why our last story for the pod, this ironic twist, which is that Snapchat, which lobbied aggressively in California against the bill, came out yesterday with a new feature, which gives parents the ability, with something called the Family Center, to have some access into how their children are behaving on Snapchat. And I thought it was, so this is the TechCrunch article, and I'll just read you the first paragraph. Snapchat today is rolling out its first set of parental controls after announcing in October that it was developing tools that would allow parents to gain better visibility into how their teens use the social networking app. The update follows the launch of similar parental controls that featured across other apps favored by teens, including Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. So I, what's interesting to me, to your point, is it might be the fear, if you're that company and you think there's a 60-40 chance that law is going to pass, even if it's the other way around, 40-60, you still have to have some strategies in place to deal with the addictive nature of your product and how it's impacting children, because like that will not be the last attempt at that law. It won't be the last attempt at that lawsuit. Far from
Yeah,
it.
they have to at least create the illusion that they're meeting the public health issue halfway. And on that point, there have been a lot of complaints about this law and other proposed legislation and regulation against the platforms, that it's a free speech issue. It's not a free speech issue.
Yeah,
It's a
no,
public health issue. And, I think it will not be difficult. It'll be easier to demonstrate that the platforms, especially Facebook, knew from their inception and investigated, did academic studies on the addictiveness of their offering and how to maximize the addictiveness, that it's going to be far easier for litigants to prove that than it was for to prove that the tobacco companies were manipulating the amount of nicotine in cigarettes to more quickly and permanently addict users. So they are vulnerable, and I think free speech is a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, we did a hour-long conversation with Yuri Hassan a couple of weeks back, and he started the conversation by saying, there's no doubt he's a neuroscientist at Princeton and has a lab there, studies the way social media impacts people's engagement and changes their minds on things. And he basically said, there's absolutely no doubt that it's addictive. Let's stop pretending that needs to be researched for one moment more. He said, social media platforms are drug dealers. And he said it so casually that I actually went back and asked him to kind of repeat it. And I said, do you mean to make that? And he's like, oh yeah, it's absolutely. He said and he had kind of a lengthy description of them as drug dealers. But I mean, this idea of social media as addictive is now getting to be a drumbeat, and a combination of science and sociology and parental experiences. I think if you were a betting
and
man,
epidemiology, because of the widespread depression that is afflicting, two entire generations of young Americans, actually people around the world. The reports of suicidal ideation and are greater than ever before, and a lot of it is linked to social media. Now the pandemic kind of fuzzes some of the issues, but the combination of the pandemic and social media has left a toll of ruin in the psyches of young people.
Yeah, no, the idea of parents saying to their young children, how much screen time are you going to have, seems like a quaint idea from an earlier time.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, well, on that note, so good news, Snap getting with the program. Bad news, the bill did not proceed, although I think we both have a sense that bills like it will make their way through somewhere. I mean, maybe it's New York, maybe it's not California. Oh, that's a good idea. All in favor of New York moving the same legislation. That'd be fascinating, because you don't have
I would suggest Delaware.
Delaware is good. We're going to be in Delaware in the fall. All right, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Steve. It's almost a pleasure as always.
Almost a pleasure indeed.
See.